I would like to start with a question for today. How does faith grow? Or maybe an easier question for you, where did faith first start for you? When was that seed planted? I'll never forget that story from one of my college professors. You see, he did not grow up in church. Actually, he had never stepped foot within a church building. He turned 20 early in the 1960s, and as he would tell you the story, he soon found himself in a band, traveling across the country from camp to camp, playing guitar and living what I can only describe as the complete hippie life. Now, somewhere in his mid-20s, he was staying at a motel, and he just couldn't sleep. And so he was up well past midnight when he finally turned on the TV. Maybe that could lull him to sleep. At 2 a.m, a televangelist came on the screen. Now, he wasn't sure if it was the things he had been consuming were wearing off, or if he had been slowly growing dissatisfied with life, or if he was just tired from the late night. But he would tell you that somehow the Holy Spirit broke through that night. And so when the preacher asked him to give his life to Jesus just after 2:30 in the morning, he did just that. And then, true to fashion, the next morning, he quit his band, he traveled home, he joined a church. He then later joined a Christian band, and this time went to travel Norway and Sweden on an evangelism tour, sharing his story. I met him, of course, many years later, a devout Christian, a professor at my school, and a loving husband and father. But where did faith begin? A 2 a.m. conversion with a televangelist in the 60s. Now, sometimes I think we're drawn to these kinds of stories. They stand out. They're clear. They're cool. They feel big. Would you like to know my story? Some of you may know it already. I was baptized as an infant, as we're going to see 2 little ones do today. My parents then brought me to church. Somewhere later, maybe around middle school, I decided that I actually did believe in faith, and later I confirmed my faith in front of my church and my peers. Poof, here I am. Any less impactful? No. Any less real? No. Less big and impressive? Well, maybe. Less flashy? Definitely. But no less sincere. I think so often we ask questions like, how does faith grow and who plants it, and how can we tell if someone is a Christian or not? And the truth is, faith is mysterious. Some people have these epic turn your life around moments with God, and some people have simply never known a day without Jesus. And there are many other stories too. And so I think that's one of the things that Jesus, our master storyteller, is talking about with these parables today. It turns out that where your faith comes from, and even the size of your faith, is not as important as what, or in this case, who, you have faith in. So let's take a look at these 2 stories. The first one, I like to think that this individual is a farmer, but I'll be honest, this farmer doesn't sound like any farmer I've ever met. Whether he sleeps or wakes, the grain grows on its own. The farmers that I know exactly how their grain is growing. There are lots of factors outside their control: the weather, when rain will come, soil conditions, when one winter will end or the next will begin. So much they can't control, but so much they can, or at least influence. The quality of the seed they purchase, how they rotate their fields, maintain their equipment, how many workers they hire. And yet Jesus describes that whether this person sleeps or wakes, the grain grows by itself. Maybe this just goes to show that Jesus wasn't a farmer. Now, that being said, maybe while a farm field that we know today doesn't work as Jesus describes, faith certainly does. Which brings me to the first point that I want to make today. It would be faith grows because God plants it. I think of the various stories I've heard throughout my life, the arguments that there must be a moment in where you give your life to Christ, or the people more like me who have never known a day without Jesus. There are these epic stories of being converted at 2 a.m, and everyday stories of a journey starting with infant baptism. And they all work, which I think is what Jesus is talking about when he says, whether we sleep or wake, the grain begins to grow. Faith grows because God plants it. And so I think there are lots of factors in our life that we can't control. You maybe know that all too well. There are also many things in our life that we can control, or at the very least influence. But faith ultimately is something that only God will truly understand. So maybe a better question we should be asking ourselves is, are we putting ourselves in places where God can more easily find us? We may not be able to control the weather of our lives or how good a growing season might be or when the next spiritual famine might come, but we can put ourselves in places where faith will be more likely to grow despite life's circumstances. God can find us anywhere, but that doesn't mean that we should make it hard for him. So I think that brings me to the second point I want to make today. The Gospel of Mark pairs these two stories together, so I want to talk about them together. I think sometimes the parable of the mustard seed is commonly told, and the version that many of us hear is from the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, where it says that the mustard seed, the smallest of all the seeds, when it is sown, grows up to become the mightiest of trees, where birds of the air make nests in its shade. I always had this image of the mightiest of trees, like a big cedar or a big oak tree, something big and tall and strong like faith. But did you hear Mark's words? He calls the mustard plant the mightiest of shrubs. It's a shrub. Turns out Mark is actually more accurate. Did you know that there's no mighty mustard tree growing in Jesus' area during his lifetime? The mustard plant is a highly prevalent, highly resilient, highly adaptable shrub. If you were to look at a picture of it, the two things that come to mind to me, the one, first I think tumbleweed. That's what it looks like. The next one I think is hedge. That's what I would plant for a good hedge. It's not a mighty tree. Now, part of me doesn't like this. I like the strong oak tree version that implies even the tiniest faith can grow big and strong, and it can. But part of me likes this shrub version too, because how often does our faith feel more like a shrub than a great oak tree? And Jesus seems to think that's okay, maybe natural even. Here are some things that I think you should know about the mighty mustard shrub. Yes, birds did indeed nest in it. Its dense branches were excellent nesting ground for all kinds of critters. It was super hardy. Like most native plants, it grew just about anywhere in any kind of soil. You could even find mustard trees growing in the cracks and crevices of cliff wall faces. I think they called it a mighty shrub because you couldn't get rid of it. It was like our dandelion or thistle, virtually impossible to kill. You pull it up by its roots and you get a foot of root and there's still more in there, and it just keeps growing back. A mustard shrub could be burned to the ground and the seeds would just sprout and regrow. Now, isn't that fitting for faith? A mustard seed, which, yes, is super tiny, can grow faith that is super durable, resistant to drought and fire and famine, provides places for others to rest, and can grow anywhere. If that's not a good description of faith, I don't know what is. So here's the second thing I'd want you to take home today. It doesn't matter how big your faith is, it matters what you have faith in. Let me use a story to help explain that. There's a pastor I know, and he's not a huge fan of flying. It doesn't make him super nervous, but he's not super comfortable with it either. And there was this one time that he needed to fly to Colorado, and he knew there was no other option. He had to fly. So he packed his bags, and he headed to the airport. To his chagrin, he ended up in the middle of a 3-aisle seat. You know that feeling. It's going to be cramped. So as he goes to take his seat, he realizes that the window seat is already occupied with a woman with an impressively crisp gray business suit. And she looked like she had flown a lot. She had her black briefcase nicely stowed and her airplane-friendly device out and looked totally relaxed. Now, shortly after boarding, a rather frantic-looking gentleman hurries onto the plane and takes the aisle seat. Now, it is clear this man is nervous. You have seen it before. There is sweat on his brow. He's wringing his hands. His shoulders are drawn up to his ears. His eyes are wide. And so the pastor says, "Are you okay?" The man immediately blurts out, "I've never been on a plane before. I'm terrified of flying, but I have to go to a family funeral, and flying is the only way. I hate flying. I hate it. What do you think are the chances we'll go down because of turbulence?" Now, the pastor, not terribly trusting of the plane, but not really distrusting either, because they have checks and balances for that, starts to explain he's sure that the plane is safe. He's sure that they'll get to their destination. Well, this is the moment where they realize that the businesswoman must have been listening, because she leans over to say, "Psh, we'll be fine. I fly this route every week for work. we won't have any trouble. So here the three are. The scared man with faith the size of, well, can we say a mustard seed? Tiny. The pastor with faith the size of a softball. And the woman with faith that could just as well be the size of the airplane. And wouldn't you know, all three of them made it to their destination just fine. And you know why? Because it doesn't matter the size of your faith, it matters what you have faith in. So for what we're talking about today, it doesn't matter if you have a great oak tree-sized faith, but kudos if you do. And it doesn't matter if your faith is more like an unruly shrub, but kudos if it is, because it's there. And it doesn't matter if you have this great dramatic conversion story or if your story is more run-of-the-mill. The size of your faith and where it comes from is not as important as what, or in this case, who, you have faith in. And when you have faith in God, you will always get to your destination. So as I send you out to go about your week this week, there are two questions I want you to have in mind. The first would be this: what do you have faith in? Or who do you have faith in? When life is hard or things don't go as expected, God promises to walk alongside you even in the darkest moments of life. And Jesus' death and resurrection means that the worst thing will never be the last thing. So who do you have faith in? My second question for you: if God is really the one who's growing our faith, are you putting yourself in places where your faith can be nurtured by God? God connects with people all sorts of places and ways, but there are certain habits and patterns that have been helping people connect with God for centuries. Going to church, being a part of a small group or a Bible study, using music to express your faith, reading your Bible, prayer time with God. The kids had all sorts of great answers for that. Are you putting yourself in places where your faith can be nurtured by God? So I think here's my hope, friends. The size of your faith and where it comes from is not as important as who you have faith in. And faith grows because God plants it. So my hope, maybe, I'm thinking about this first story with the farmer. I wonder if we can be more like that person who scatters seeds and just scatter seed to the wind, whether for ourselves or for others, whether we do a perfectly good job of it or not. And then I hope we pay attention as faith grows. Can we trust in the God who always brings the harvest home?